Good afternoon and welcome to another edition of FNR Ask the Expert. Today we're going to be talking about pond management. Everything from what's going on with your pond right now as it's probably frozen over, and also pond management, creating it. How do you create a plan for your pond for spring? What things can you be doing now to prepare for that? And then what you can do if you have some of those early season issues after things start to thaw. So today we're joined by Mitch Ziske, who is the Purdue Extension fisheries specialist. And he also does some work with Illinois Indiana Sea Grant that you might see from time to time. And also Dave Osborne, who is the Ripley County Extension educator. So gentlemen, I'll just throw it out to you guys. Mitch, get us started. What am I actually seeing going on with my pond as it has started to ice over now that the weather has finally gotten cold?
Yeah. So thanks for having us on today. So yeah, I imagine through most of Indiana now the ice is starting to form. It's been a little later than normal. But what happens when ice forms on a pond is it creates a barrier between the surface of the pond and the air, and a lot of oxygen exchange usually happens at this water air interface, and so when you get some ice on the pond, that sort of prevents that oxygen exchange. And if the ice is nice and clear, that's okay because there is some vegetation usually in the pond that can still photosynthesize and produce oxygen. But if snow builds up on top of that ice, probably like has happened in a lot of areas at the moment, then you're not getting any oxygen being added to that pond. And if if that ice and snow persist for a long period of time, you can have oxygen reduce in your pond to the point where you can end up with fish kills. So we've produced an informative little diagram here at Purdue. I'll just share my screen to give a better sense of what I'm talking about here, but hopefully you can see that. So this is sort of what happens. You've got your nice little happy pond here in the wintertime. There's not a lot of vegetation because, a lot of it does die off annually, but there's usually still some vegetation in the pond. And like I said, if it's clear ice or there's short periods of ice cover on the pond, that vegetation can still be happy, photosynthesize, and produce oxygen. As the snow builds up, it can block the sunlight, and then with no sunlight, the plants start to die. They don't produce oxygen, and then when the bacteria break down those plants, they use up oxygen as well. So you can end up in a situation with really low oxygen in your pond. And if that happens, you end up with a winter fish kill, which some listeners may have experienced before. This tends to happen in shallower ponds more frequently than deep ponds, and obviously the smaller your pond can make your pond more prone to this as well. But oftentimes you don't even see the fish floating because there's ice covering the pond, and come springtime you might try and catch some fish and you're not catching any fish, and because a few of them might have died off in the wintertime. But so that's what's happening in ponds at the moment. They're frozen. There's lower oxygen exchange, but because we've had, this is really the first time that ice is set up in a lot of ponds in Indiana. It's a pretty late season, so typically the pond should be much better off this year than say if the pond set up in December, if the ice set up in December, like can sometimes occur.
Thanks for that update there. And Dave, I'm just going to bring you in there. We were talking before everybody joined us about ice fishing and how that's not been great this season here in Indiana. What can you share with us about maybe conditions we should be worried about when it comes to ice fishing, and like what expectations are, and just a little bit about maybe what you do in regards to that?
Yeah, I've been watching the chat pages on Facebook and some of the Facebook groups, Indiana ice fishing and things like that. And there have been ice fishing for a couple weeks now on certain ponds, smaller water bodies in northern Indiana. Some of the larger lakes and reservoirs are still open in the middle, so they haven't frozen, but they're fishing on some of the bays. Typically this time of year in northern Indiana, most of those ponds and lakes are locked up and they're fishing on them. Some of them have fish huts out and things like that. Southern Indiana, we've had no more than about an inch and a half of skim ice, and then it'll thaw out and actually the ponds will open up. And so we've had no ice fishing probably in the southern half to maybe 2/3 of the state. And one of the things you want to look for is you need 4 inches of good ice to be safe. If you're out there on 2 inches of ice, you better have safety equipment with you. You better have somebody else with you, because you play around on 2 to 3 inches of ice long enough, you're going to swim in the winter. So if you're a polar bear and you like cold water, go to it. But to me, no fish is worth risking life and limb. A lot of times there's 2 or 3 people get involved in a situation like that. Somebody goes through and 2 people go try to help them, and then all 3 of them end up in a very tough situation. So remember that basic rule of thumb: 4 inches of clear, good, hard ice is a safety factor for ice fishing.
More power to you folks who want to go sit out there and freeze your tail off just to get a little bit of grub, but it sounds like fun. Maybe I'll buy a parka sometime and join you. But so let's talk about what is happening in our pond right now. Mitch did a great promo video for this and talked about, you know, how the ponds are icing over and things like that. I know some of us donated Christmas trees, things like that, tried to put out some of those things in our waterways, our ponds, things like that to make fish habitats. How long will it take, and does the winter and the freeze affect that, as you were talking about fish kills and things like that, Mitch?
Yeah, so you know, I think that's a good point. You know, winter is often a good time to add fish habitat to ponds because it's much easier to drag Christmas trees out onto the ice and then wait for them to thaw out and drop into place than trying to wrestle them out in a boat or, you know, swim out with them or whatever you do. So, but if you put some habitat in the fall, or you got it out this winter before it froze, you know, that is already starting to mature in the pond. There's likely some algae setting up on it. There's some invertebrates colonizing it. So it's, you know, the fall, winter, and early spring is a good time to put fish habitat out, particularly if you're looking to put fish habitat out to encourage spawning. You want to get that out early before the fish are starting to spawn, so that that habitat can sort of age in the pond and sort of naturalize with the pond, and therefore the fish are more likely to use that come, you know, May or June when they're spawning, rather than if you just plonk it out a week or 2 before they want to start spawning. So yeah, habitat's a good thing to start thinking about in the winter. And you know, if it's freezing cold outside, your pond's iced up, you don't want to sit on a bucket and catch a few fish, you can always be in your garage building some fish habitat. Is a nice winter activity too.
Dave, anything you want to share about fish habitats or things you've got put out around your pond? I know you do a lot of this out in the community, and what are some of the things I could be building, like Mitch is talking about these habitats?
It's definitely a good time of year to put in hardwoods, cut them green, cut some of the green hardwoods like cedar trees, black locust, you know, trees like that. A lot of people will actually concrete those in what they call the pickle bucket method, putting them exactly where you want them, and the ice melts and they fall right into place is a great way to add habitat. I've actually had a couple people be very successful in putting spawning habitat out this time of year. If they get 7, 8 inches of ice where they can get a small little garden tractor with a front loader on it, they can actually go to a bank and put 2 or 3 feet wide, 6 inches of pea gravel on the ice. And then that pea gravel falls into place and actually helps supplement nesting cover, because a lot of our ponds, one of the very limiting factors in our ponds is really good, adequate nesting substrate and nesting cover. So I've worked with a couple farmers over the years that have actually put the pea gravel in place on top of the ice, or used even a mini excavator with the excavator on the bank, and reached the arm out and actually put the gravel in place on the ice and placed that gravel. Because if they try that anytime during the summer or spring, they're liable to sink the equipment. But once the ground's frozen, it gives them an opportunity to do some of that kind of work. So habitat and structure development is very key, and a good time to do that when we get frozen ground and good ice conditions.
Just a reminder for those of you watching us live on Facebook here, if you have any questions, please put those in the comment section. That's why we do these live events, so that you can ask your questions and learn about how you can, whether it's rehab your pond or start from scratch and create a pond management plan. So on that note, Mitch, what are some of the things that I should be looking at right now as I begin to think about either putting in a pond or taking a look at what I do have and what I need to do for the future?
So winter is a great time to be planning for your pond, and something that we've been trying to encourage landowners to do is to develop a management plan for their pond. You know, good, healthy ponds and good fishing rarely happen by chance, and if you put some forethought into what you want out of your pond, then you can start to establish the things you need to do to get to where you want to be. And you know, in the summertime, there's all sorts of things going around. We're out there fishing and doing other things, and so winter can be a good time to spend some time thinking about that. And we have some great resources on our website that talks through the process of creating a management plan, and we even have a template that people can use to build their management plan. So that, you know, just thinking about planning in general is a good thing to start with at this time of year. And I guess that includes, you know, you might need to be thinking about, you know, buying things for your pond. Maybe you need some equipment. Maybe you are looking to stock some fish, or you know, get some chemicals for algal treatment. Those are the sorts of things that you don't want to be thinking about at the point you need them. It's good to have those on hand. So you know, planning ahead for some of that stuff is good too. And one last thing I'll just mention is, you know, it's really good to get in the habit of assessing the structural integrity of your pond. If you have a dam, you know, making sure there are no leaks, you know, making sure the spillway is clear. And winter's a great time to do that because the trees and bushes are not overgrown. It's easy to get to some of these structures and evaluate them. So, and once again, you know, if you're not sitting out there on the ice fishing, then you've actually got a bit of time this time of year to do some of these things that are the less glamorous parts of having a pond. So.
Okay, so you threw out a lot of things there. One of the things I know that everyone heard loud and clear probably is stocking fish for your pond. Is that something I need to do every year? Should I wait and see if I had a fish kill over the winter? When should I tackle that? And then if I do feel I need to restock my pond, what should I do to go about that?
Yeah, so a lot of people ask that question. I'm glad you focused in on that. And, you know, there are lots of reasons to stock fish in your pond. You've got a new pond, you want to establish fish in it. Like you said, if you've had a fish kill and your population is pretty much down to nothing, then you definitely need to restock that. But a lot of times you don't actually need to stock fish to solve fish problems in your pond. You know, you might find that you have, you know, really small bluegill and small bass. You got a lot of them, but you just don't have many big ones in there. And a lot of people think, well, I need to stock some new fish to get them to grow big. But in that situation, stocking fish will actually make it worse, and you need to think about removing some fish to provide space for others to grow. So stocking is actually, you know, there's only a few specific situations where stocking is needed. And so I think working with your local extension educator or a biologist can help you make those decisions. And then if you do decide you need to stock fish, then you need to try and find a place to get those fish from. And the Indiana Department of Natural Resources has a list of I guess, licensed fish hatcheries where you can buy fish from. And then you might want to talk to them early, like now, to see if you can get on their waiting lists or get some quotes from them and things like that.
Dave, do you have anything you want to add there in regards to stocking your pond? I know you've done this for a lot of years. Any good and bad experiences you want to share with us so we don't mess ours up?
Yeah, I would say 99% of the time, Mitch is right. Stocking is not the solution. People think that's the solution. I'll put more genetics in there or more fish that'll grow better, because my fish just don't grow well. And almost all the time, that's population management that's the problem. So ice fishing is a great way the fish are concentrated. And if you catch 50 bluegill and every one of them looks like a carbon copy of each other, and you don't have 3 or 4 size classes represented in those bluegill, you have a stunted pond. So it's a good time to say, hey, what do I do for a stunted pond? Well, you've got to harvest, you've got to manage numbers, and you've got to take, maybe in an acre pond, you've got to take a couple thousand bluegill out. And people on a normal well-managed pond are supposed to take 500 bluegill out a year per acre. And very few people hit that number. And so if you find out that all your fish are the same size, you may be needing to take thousands of those out. And the winter is a great time to do that because the fish don't degrade. They come out of the cold water onto the cold ice. It's like putting them straight in the cooler. You can fish all day, clean them that evening, and they're in great shape because you kept them in the cooler all day long. So, and the fish taste better out of cold water because they've slowed their process. They've kind of cleaned their systems out. If they've been eating on the bottom and eating actually the bottom muck and detritus that's on the bottom. So the fish are cleaner tasting, and they're great table fare, and they're a great time to fill your freezer full of fish for the year.
This is the second session we've done with Dave, and he is all about easy access and filling that freezer. So if he tells you it's a good time to go out there and start getting your fish, now's the time. But we'll move on from that subject and talk a little about actually creating a plan. Mitch, what should I be doing? We talked a little bit about stocking our pond, but what other things should I be looking at to prepare for spring?
If you have a pond, maybe you've had it for a long time, maybe you've recently bought a property that has one on it, and you haven't done a management plan before, and you don't know too much about what's happening in your pond, then the first thing you really need to do is assess that pond. You need to figure out what fish are in there, what the fish populations look like, and the best way to do that is to go fishing. And you can go fishing in the wintertime, go fishing in the spring, and then later in the spring as the fish start to move shallow to spawn, you can walk around the pond and look at spawning activity. And all of that information can help you determine what your fish population looks like right now. And then once you know that, you can determine what you need to do to get to where you want to be. And so it's, we always think of try and explain that planning in your pond is a little bit like planning for retirement. You need to think about, long-term goals, medium-term goals, and then do some actions to get you there. So if you haven't thought about planning your pond management before, I'd check out our publications. They give a good introduction to that. And then once you've got that information, you can then decide if you need to reach out to a biologist or even a consultant to help you plan your management.
Dave, anything you want to chip in there about developing a plan and goods and bads, if you will? I know, again, relying on your experience, because I'm sure if it can be done wrong, you've seen it done wrong.
Yeah, you kind of got to decide what your goals are. And that can be done anytime, but like Mitch said, this is the time of year that if you've got woody vegetation around the pond and you want to make some openings for the grandkids to have an area to fish, this may be the time of the year to do some of that kind of maintenance. It's a good time of year to get out around the pond. Like Mitch said, if you hear water running on the backside of a pond and you've had a drought condition, you might find leaks. So just being able to physically be around your pond and to see the different things going on. It's just a good time of year to get out of the house, get out of the cabin fever and get out and do some of those things around your pond. Cattails, you can actually get rid of a lot of the vegetation that would fall into the pond by burning cattails. If you live in an area where burning's able and you've got a little snow on the ground, you can take a lot of vegetation out so they don't fall in the water and just fill the bottom with muck and dying vegetation. So different things you can do this time of year to help manage that pond, and it's a good time of year to get out and do that.
Well, you just took the words right out of my mouth. I was going to ask you about some of that vegetation, like the cattails. You mentioned burning them. What other things can I do? Should I do it now? Should I wait till spring to alleviate that cattail problem?
Okay, so cattails, if you spray cattails as they come up and green up in the spring, you burn the tops off, you make them mad, and you make more cattails sprout out from the nodes. A cattail is kind of like an aquatic Johnson grass. They grow from rhizomes. All the energy in a cattail in the spring and early summer is going up for the plant development and for seed development. So if we really want to control cattails with a systemic herbicide, Systemic herbicides are going to work much better in the fall. We get some systemic action to kill some of the root systems. And then as the young plants come up from damaged root systems or root systems that the herbicide went to the node but stopped, then we can kill some of those younger plants. But cattails, to kill those, it's going to take a couple seasons to do that. But a fall application is the first step. A spring application is not that effective. Mechanically, you can take them out, but you'll find out if you pull and dig cattails, you're going to have a bunch come back because every piece of root can become a new plant. So knowing the life cycle of those plants is important to know, how we control those. The other part of that is we don't want to take cattails completely out of a pond. Their structure, their habitat, that they're just like the structure we talked about putting in with woody vegetation. Aquatic vegetation provides a lot of food base, a lot of structure, a lot of substrate for aquatic plants and insects and things like that to grow on, and is really important for the health of an overall pond. So you got to kind of decide what you can deal with when you're managing aquatic weeds and what level is okay. If you want it completely clean so you can swim in it like a swimming pool, I always tell people in my programs, then build a swimming pool, because a pond's never going to be a pool and you're never going to be happy with it.
Good advice there. We don't want people complaining about algae as they're swimming. That doesn't sound like fun to me. So Mitch, we have a question came in from Andy, and Andy wants to know, he has a 10-foot deep pond. It's a little bit over an acre. They have put algicide, copper sulfate on it and added some habitat. They've also added a fish feeder, but they want to get large bluegills and bigger predators. He wants to know basically what he should do in terms of stocking, and will the copper sulfate kill some of the things he's looking to stock?
Yeah, thanks, Wendy. I see the question here, and thanks for that question. So there are a few things to address here, I guess, with regards to what the copper sulfate kills and doesn't kill. I don't know what impact it has on snails and crayfish, and if Dave knows more about that, he can talk about that in a minute. If we don't know that, I can do some research and get back to you after this live event. But yeah, obviously it does kill the filamentous algae that you don't want there. It definitely also kills the phytoplankton. And that's something that I talk to pond owners about a little bit, is that the phytoplankton, particularly the phytoplankton in the spring, that is really important. Those phytoplankton blooms are really important to sort of kickstart the food web in the spring. And so sometimes if you kill that off, then you're allowing non-desirable algae to sort of establish, and you can disrupt that food web. And so I definitely get that some of these algal problems you want to sort of get on top of early and keep them in check for the year. But sometimes, allowing that initial phytoplankton bloom to establish in the spring can be good for your pond productivity. Also, I see that you're adding a fish feeder, and a fish feeder can help the growth of the fish in your pond, but this can actually cause greater problems with algae down the road, because what you're doing is you're adding a lot of extra nutrients to the pond, and so I definitely recommend working with a professional to make sure that you're not adding the feed, you get these blooms, and then you treat the blooms with chemicals, and then you add feed, you get a bloom, and then you create this cycle that can become very expensive. And so you might want to just look into that, and I'd be happy to talk to you more if you wanted to reach out to me after this program. With regards to crayfish, like I said, I'm not sure what impact copper sulfate has on crayfish. I will say that, if you have a good population of sunfish in your pond, then that's going to be the main forage for your bass and your predators. You can supplement with minnows if you want, and fathead minnows are definitely the best forage to stock because they don't cause other problems down the road. but they also don't, it's difficult to establish populations of those in ponds. And so when you add minnows, then you're essentially adding pretty expensive fish food. They'll probably get gobbled up pretty quickly. And if that's something you want to do on a regular basis, there is a bit of investment in there. But I guess what I would say is that, yeah, if you're looking to add feed as well as treat with copper sulfate, that's going to be sort of a delicate dance. And if you're willing to put in the time for management, it's going to take a bit more active management than just sort of leaving your pond. So, but Dave might have some more insight on that too.
Big bluegill requires fewer bluegill, so it's a population management. If you look at one of our publications, we actually have a scenario of big bluegill can help you walk through doing an analysis of the bluegill population and the bass population, and then their recommendations in that publication. But big bluegill, you don't have huge numbers of bluegill when you have big bluegill. So it's a numbers game. So you'll want to keep a heavy dose of the smaller bluegill to put that bluegill growth potential on fewer fish. So it's all a numbers game. That pond only has a certain amount of growth potential, and if you divide it between a whole lot more mouths, each fish grows less. So it's simply a growth and energy budgeting game, and big bluegill require a lot fewer bluegill.
And just to add on to that, one of the easiest ways to get fewer bluegill is to have a pretty high bass population. And then if you have a high bass population, it's going to be tricky to get large bass. And so there is a bit of a delicate dance there. If you want both large bluegill and large bass, that's where it would really pay to work with somebody who's done stuff like that before, and maybe even talk to other pond owners that have done these things in the past. And there's a link I can link to a Facebook group that's I think has about 1,700 pond owners in it that discusses all sorts of things, and you might be able to reach out to some of those too. But I think that if I had to classify what's the most difficult fish management plan, it would be large bluegill and large bass in the same pond. And so yeah, just recognize that, I guess, is what I would say.
And realize that every pond situation is different. This pond management there's a science behind it, but it's more of an art form. It's kind of like a doctor practices medicine. Well, people practice pond management because every pond can be different. You can have two ponds on the same farm. One grows big bluegill, the other won't. And people say, why not? And you can't hardly figure out why not. They're managing the same. So realize that every pond's different, and what you do with a pond, you may have to tweak that and adjust what you read in a publication or what you hear from us, because there's special circumstances that pond has that maybe some other ponds don't have. So
before we wrap up about what type of fish should I stock, maybe jump into that a little bit. We're talking about whether, more bluegill, more bass, whatever. Is it based on what I'm expecting out of my pond? If I just want a recreational fish, if I just want, it for healthy habitat, what difference does that make in terms of my pond management plan?
Yeah, so I get, that's the key part of the plan is deciding what your objective is for the pond, and you need to be honest with yourself in terms of what you want, but also the amount of work that you want to put into that management. And if you have a pond that you want to swim in, your management actions are going to be a lot different than if you have a pond where you want to attract wildlife, or maybe have some fish populations in there. And so there's definitely a lot of different roads you can travel down with your pond management, but you need to define your goals so you know which path to take to get there. And if you have, sometimes you can have multiple objectives for a pond, but sometimes they can be competing objectives. It might be hard to have a very clear swimming pond if you also want to have a very productive fish population. So.
Okay, we just had a question come in, and they want to know what invasive plants or animals threaten ponds in Indiana, and when should I be managing for those invasives? Dave, do you want to take that one to start?
Anything you see at the aquarium shop or the water garden shop is a no-no. Do not plant vegetation in your pond. Mother Nature will take care of planting what needs to go there. Some of the fish species that kind of can become invasive and kind of take over are things like green sunfish, bullhead catfish, koi, carp, shad, things like that. So if you're thinking about minnows to supplement feeding or put minnows in a pond for bass to eat, don't go to the creek and seine your own. You cannot identify every small minnow, and you may put a carp minnow in there, you may put an Asian carp minnow in there, a bullhead catfish. All those things are very detrimental to normal regular fish populations. But as far as what fish you should stock, it's what fish you really want to catch. If you love channel catfish, then put channel catfish in there. But realize how many can go in a pond, and you don't want too many in there because they start stirring the bottom up if they don't have enough food. So realize that crappie compete directly with small bass. So if you put crappie in a pond, your bass growth and your crappie growth are both going to suffer because they directly compete for the same food items. So you can stock what you want to catch. Just realize that there are trade-offs for fish that you put in there. But just don't ever plant anything in a pond. Let Mother Nature kind of put what needs to go there, and that generally tends to be, normal type plants. Ever so often, if you've got geese or ducks that are there, sometimes they'll bring in some invasives. But if you see a lily pad or something like that, those are things you need to get on right away. Get them pulled out, get them treated with a systemic herbicide, and don't let them go for a season, because one season, if they get a foothold, may make them almost impossible to get out of a pond. So you just get on anything you think doesn't belong there. Get on it early.
Just to follow up on that, we have a publication about fish stocking in ponds. It talks about the common species that do well in ponds. It talks about the species maybe to avoid and why. And so definitely check that out if you're thinking of stocking fish. And the other thing is, once you get problematic or invasive species in your ponds, it can be almost impossible to get rid of them apart from draining the pond completely and starting again. So I think it's a great question. It's something to think about, and it's something to work as hard as you can to avoid these issues. And if you have multiple ponds, or you go between your ponds and your neighbor's ponds, make sure you clean your equipment and your boots or whatever it is, your kayak, clean that stuff off to make sure you're not moving species between ponds that could potentially become invasive.
Mitch, you walked right into our next question. So not everybody is always on top of things, or maybe I inherited my property and now I have a pond and I didn't before. How do I know when I need to just chuck it and start from scratch? Or if I haven't done anything in a few years, where do I even start?
Yeah, that's a good question. And to be honest, that's the position that a lot of people find themselves in. We all talk about pond management. We have these great plans that people can do, but a lot of cases, it's a situation that you just described. And so really at that point, you're in sort of pond restoration mode. You want to try and see, well, is it worthwhile trying to restore what's there and battle what's there, or do I start again? And it depends on a number of different things. Obviously a smaller pond is maybe easier to drain and start again than a large pond. Some ponds don't have the ability to easily be drained. And starting again is expensive. If you need to get equipment in to dredge out muck, and if you need to restock with fish, those things can be expensive. But then on the flip side, if you're trying to apply herbicides or something to deal with problem aquatic plants for 3-4 years in a row, that can become expensive too. So, I think if it's all about, how degraded the pond is. If you do an assessment and you find, well, I do get some problem algae and plants in the summer, and I have bass and bluegill here, but they're all a bit stunted. That's a situation that you can probably remediate without having to start again. But if you have a pond that's full of bullheads and they're stirring up the bottom and not allowing plants to grow, and you can't establish bluegill populations, then that might be a situation where you need to drain it out, get rid of those invasive species, and start again. So it goes back to that assessment, trying to assess what you've got there to help you make that decision.
And there are professional groups around the state: Aquatic Control, Jones Fish Hatchery, several aquatic biologists that will come out and do a lake survey. If you don't have the time to do that yourself and you want to get a feel for what you have on a new property or new lake, you can actually have a lake or a pond assessment done. It costs a little bit of money, but these guys are professionals. And if you tell them what your goals are, a lot of times they can give you a pretty good prescription of how do you start, where do you need to go. And so there are professionals out there that'll do this for you. You can contact some of the extension educators. Some of us love to come out and do that kind of stuff with you, but others don't have any knowledge in that area. But there are professionals that'll help you do that if you don't have the time or the knowledge to do it yourself.
And I guess just to plug our website, we have a great tool on our website where you can go in and put what county you're in on our website, and it'll tell you all the pond and land and wildlife professionals in that county that can maybe help you with some of your questions.
Another question we had here, Mitch. You guys have talked a little bit about algae and the effects of that. What do I do if I have kind of one that keeps coming back? I mean, is that something where I need to contact a professional? Is that something I can handle myself, or am I back at square one?
Algae is something that's difficult to manage because it blooms and grows quickly compared to some of these other plants. But anytime you get any plant, continuing to be a problem, I always look to see, try and find the source of that problem rather than treating the problem, because if and the source is usually too many nutrients, and particularly with algae, whether it's the phytoplankton, the stuff that makes it look like a green soup, or whether it's that stringy mat forming algae, both of those can respond and grow pretty quickly to nutrient inputs in a pond. And so if you put a lot of fertilizer on your lawn that runs into the pond, if you have ag fields that drain into your pond, that's adding a lot of nutrients. That's going to allow those algae to grow, and no matter what you do from a treatment standpoint, you're going to probably have algal problems until you can deal with some of those excessive nutrients. And one of the best ways to do that is to provide buffer vegetation around the side to help trap those nutrients. So those cattails that Dave was talking about, they do a great job at trapping nutrients before they get into the pond, and our other sort of shrubs and trees around your pond can help with that too. So usually when I've got a plant problem that keeps coming back time and time again, I look to what's causing that. And it might take a bit of time to solve the what's causing that problem, but it can end up saving you a lot of money than just putting chemicals in year after year after year.
I went and looked at a pond this fall, and the guy had been reading pond management materials from North Carolina, South Carolina, Oklahoma. And he says, I really fertilized the turd out of this pond this year because those publications talk about fertilizing ponds. In the Midwest, with our limestone base and all that, we very seldom, if ever, need to fertilize ponds. All we're going to do is create a huge problem with algal blooms. And one of the key things you can do if you want to determine how fertile your pond is wade out in the water, get about chest deep, and put your hand down about your waist, which is 18 to 20 inches. If you can't see your hand, your pond is extremely fertile. If you can see your hand at about 12 to 15 inches, but it disappears at 18 to 20 inches, it's still plenty fertile. If you can see your toes when you're standing chin deep in the water, then we may need to talk, but that doesn't happen very often in Indiana ponds. So water clarity with that phytoplankton and zooplankton play a big role in telling you how fertile your pond is. So that turquoise green color that your water gets is that fertility, is that planktonous community. And it's the basis for all the food chain in your pond. But do not in the Midwest apply any fertilizer to a pond. We almost never need fertilizer.
So you're saying it's not going to help my fish grow?
Not at all.
Good to know.
And Wendy, I just want to follow up on that. I see we have a question here about stocking Daphnia, and that's a little bit of the same sort of realm, because if we think about fertilizing, we want to add the very, very base of the food web that's nutrients, which we don't need to do in Indiana. And it's a little bit like if you think about Daphnia and other zooplankton, you know, that we're naturally going to have plenty of phytoplankton in the pond, and because of that, we're naturally going to have lots of zooplankton for small fishes and things to eat. And so I do not see a need to ever have to stock Daphnia or other zooplankton, and I also don't see that they naturally exist in the millions, and I just don't know what sort of capacity we would have to stock them in to have any effect in a pond either. So,
thanks for adding that, Mitch. Good to know. As we look to move on to a couple other pond management issues, if you have any more questions, put those in the comments on Facebook. If we don't get to those today, we will have Mitch and Dave go on and answer some questions after the fact. So if you're watching this in archive, please know they are available for you. They are the experts for a reason, and they are willing to help. So one thing I wanted to ask about, Mitch, is adding aeration to my pond. Is that something I need to do here in Indiana? And if so, when should that process happen?
Yeah, I'd say Dave knows a lot about aeration, and I'll pass it over to him in a minute. But I think if you can afford it and make it happen, aeration is a great tool to add to your pond. It can help with the fish kills you see in the summer and the winter, and thinking about aeration now or early in the spring is much better than thinking about it in the heat of summer when you've already had some issues set up. But I'll pass it over to Dave. He can speak a lot about aeration.
Yeah, if you're going to invest in fish management and pond, and you want it as healthy as it can be, your best bet for insurance is aeration. And I like to see aeration that's put in the spring when the ice is off for a week or two. You turn that aeration on, and you leave it on until fall, when the water temperature comes down below 60 degrees. You don't have to run it all winter, but if you've got a lake that you might have had winter kills, you can run that in the winter. It's kind of sad when the people run them around here, because I know that's not a pond I'm going to ice fish on because it doesn't freeze solid enough. But aeration also keeps your entire pond and life cycle aerobic throughout the year, which means that dying vegetation, that dying algae decomposes much quicker, doesn't become a mucky mess on the bottom. If you've ever walked on the bottom of a pond and you sink halfway up to your knee, you kind of know what I'm talking about. That's dead and dying vegetation. That zone in there is very anaerobic, and it takes a long time for that stuff to decompose. Oxygenation and aeration of the pond will help that decomp happen quicker. It'll help keep your pond cleaner, and it just helps all the way around in your pond. So yes, if you can afford it, get an aerator, buy an aerator that's specifically for aeration. I've had farmers tell me they were going to put an air compressor in and run a line out there, and that's all they needed. You tell me how long it was before your air compressor melted down, because they are not meant to run 24/7. But aeration is very important, especially if you want to protect that fish population. There are two different types. There's deep aeration, which is an air filter in the bottom of the pond, and there's surface aeration for shallower ponds. So getting a professional that understands aeration to look at your pond and determine which method you need is important too.
Yeah, and I guess just to add on that, when you're looking at different types of aeration and what your pond may need, the key is getting that vertical mixing of the water. If that's the key with aeration, and sometimes you see these big elaborate fountains that are shooting the surface water up and it splashes down on the surface, and that doesn't have near the effect that a deep aeration system that vertically mixes that water does. So that's the key when you're looking at aeration.
Great. And one final thing, as people start, the ponds start thawing and they start noticing they're not catching anything, how do they know if it's a fish kill or what's going on, if it's just they're coming out slow because it's been cold? Where should they start, and when should they start to get concerned, if at all?
Yeah, that's a good question. say you were catching fish just fine last year up into the fall, and then maybe you didn't ice fish or whatever, and yeah, in the spring sometimes it can be hard. Are the fish lethargic and I'm just not catching them yet, or have I lost a lot of fish? And I would the good thing about many of our pond species is that they're spring spawners and they spawn in shallow areas, and so I think once the water warms up to about 65 degrees, in May, something like that, June, then you should really be able to get a sense of whether you've still got a good fish population in there, whether you see them or whether you start catching them then. And at that point, if you don't see any of your fishes, it's likely that you've had a substantial fish kill. But I wouldn't, if the pond thaws in March or April and you get out there and you don't start catching stuff right away, I wouldn't immediately think, hey, I've had a fish kill, I better stock a bunch of fish in there. And even come May or June, if I'm not seeing the fish, I'd want to do a thorough assessment that year or the next few months to see what's happening with my fish before I decide I need to put some more in there.
One of the best tools for a pond owner is a pair of polarized sunglasses. You can see a lot deeper into the pond. If you get into the 1st of June and you do not see bluegill and bass along the bank nesting, you'll know they're gone, because their entire life cycles around, I gotta go nest. And so they put everything they are and everything they live to do is to nest. And so if you walk around that entire pond and you're not seeing 2 or 3 nesting sites per acre for bluegill, and you're not seeing a dozen or so bass in the early May, the bass will start nesting before the bluegill. If you don't see them on nest and the nest just looks like a plate size or a 5-gallon bucket size, clear spot on the bottom, with sunglasses, and most of the time they're within 2 feet deep. If you don't see those, you have a problem, and you probably need to do something to get some fish back in there. But just because you're not catching them doesn't mean they're not there. But if you don't see them by early June, you probably have an issue.
And I'll just point out that in our fish management publication, we have some tips on there about assessing your fish populations, and apart from catching fish, visual surveys are great. You can also get like bait nets or cast nets, and sometimes you can catch fish that are smaller than you'd usually catch to get them. Maybe you lost some of your big fish, but you've got a good group of young of the year fish coming up that'll replace what you've lost. So investing, those cast nets are not that expensive and takes a bit of skill to learn how to throw them, but they can be a very valuable fish assessment tool in a pond.
All right, well, I think that's about it, unless there's anything else you guys want to add on things people should be cognizant of as we deal with this, hopefully for Dave, potential ice fishing season these next few weeks, and then also as we let them thaw for the rest of us and begin to enjoy them for spring. Anything else you want to add?
No, I would just say, if you haven't already, check out our publications, check out our website, and drop us a line if you have any questions. We're always happy to help individuals, throughout the year on their various questions. So,
yep, you can find me on the extension site, Ripley County Extension site. Feel free to reach out to me. My phone number's there. Call me if you have personal questions. I love to talk ponds.
And I'm gonna give a shout out, because I know Mitch won't do it for himself. A couple of times a month, usually, we get a new edition of Pond University, which is a new podcast that Mitch and Megan Gunn from our department are putting together. That's part of Natural Resources University, a new podcast network that started at the end of the year. So I'm going to put that link in the Facebook comments. Make sure and check that out. He's had Dave on. He's had some great guests on in the last, I think we're at episode 6 coming up now, Mitch. So check that out. The link is there. And as for Ask the Expert, we'll be back in 2 weeks. We'll be talking salamanders. So from ponds to under rocks. So that'll be Dr. Rod Williams and Nick Bergmeyer from Purdue Extension. And also Spencer Courtwright will be with us that day as well. So we have a chock full schedule. We're already filled up through, I think, April. Every 2 weeks, you'll see us. Unlike we did over the summer where we were every week, we're going to go every other week. So mark your calendar from now until mid-April. We may throw in a few specials for you, but certainly mark your calendar. It'll either be at noon or 3. We will definitely put it on Facebook and on social media for you to see. But thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you for the great questions. And again, if you have any further pond management questions or you didn't get the answer you were looking for, put that in the comment section on Facebook, and Mitch and Dave will get back to you. So once again, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks.